Well, hello, everyone. My pleasure to spend the next few minutes with you talking about a few topics, but I actually wanted to start with a story. My journey coming here today. So I'm here representing HRCI. I'm an assessor for an organizational certification care of HRCI. And so before I came here early. I came here on Sunday. You know, I'm a Canadian. I also represent the Canadian standards body in terms of developing technical standards for human resources. And you know, this time of year, it's nice to come to the Gulf, right? Because, November, winter time, there's a bit of a time change to get used to. But when I left, it was I don't know, JD, you flew here for a while, yeah? What was the temperature when you left DC? Yeah, 39, yeah. It was 39 where I was coming from too. It's nice to come to Kuwait, and so my question to you, my question to all of you is, based on my first story, what's the lesson? What's the lesson? I got your attention. What's the lesson in my first story? Change? Adaptation? Standards, maybe? Maybe you're getting ahead. No, I'm not getting an answer from you. Measures. Yeah. What was the temperature where I came from? Do you remember? 39, and JD, what was the temperature where you came from? And you came from DC, right? Where do I live? I live in Dubai. It was 39. 39 Celsius. I've lived in Dubai for the past 16 years. I have a mortgage in Dubai. That's home for me. JD lives in Washington, D.C. 39, November. It's a bit cold for D.C. How many of you assumed we both came from North America to get here? Lesson 1. That's one of the problems with HR. We've had a lot of presentations over these past 2 days. Really smart, competent, capable people sharing their wisdom and knowledge with the room. And we talk about HR. But are we talking the same language? Engagement, turnover. Pick your metric. Are we speaking the same language when we talk? Someone was sitting up here yesterday talking about employee turnover, 7%. Is that good? Is that not good? How can you even answer that question until you say, 7% this week, 7% this year? There's kind of a difference between these two metrics, aren't there? So that's my first sort of story I want to talk to you about. The second one is my background. I am the convener or project leader for ISO 30414 Human Capital Standards. I am an assessor for HRSI, which is a subsidiary of HRCI that does organizational certifications based on ISO standards. My second story for everyone. Anyone recognize the city? Yes. The city. Tokyo. It's a bit of a giveaway. Fuji-san, the Mount Fuji. Tokyo Tower. I was in Tokyo 2 weeks ago at the annual plenary for TC260, which is the Technical Committee for Developing Standards in Human Resources. Room like this, people from all over the world. But you know what was really interesting about that event? There were a lot of interesting things. But before I tell you, let me ask a question to the group. How many of us in this room are HR or HR-related practitioners? Hands up. HR. You do HR-related. You may be HR in your organization. You may be a consultant. How many don't work in HR at all? How many of you are completely unrelated to HR? Any hands in the room? No. You work for an HR organization. Nice try. At this event in Tokyo 2 weeks ago, when we were doing our human resource plenary, a room like this, at the back of the room, there were tables for guests. In that room were 2 individuals from investment companies. They had nothing to do with human resources. What's the second lesson from my story, my second story to you? What's the second lesson? The second takeaway? Or let me be an L&D. What's the learning outcome from my story? Yes?
You don't have to work in a specific field to be interested in it or to improve in it.
I like that. Yes. Any other takeaways from my story? I have a takeaway. We're in a room full of HR people right now talking about HR. Wouldn't it be nice if we had people who weren't in HR who wanted to be here to hear what we're saying? We can all get together and talk about engagement and empowerment and DEI. And you want to know a secret? We're talking to ourselves. You know the expression, it's like singing to the choir. We're speaking to ourselves. That's not ideal. What we want to get to a point is where people want to be in this room to hear what we're talking about because it's important and it impacts them. We're not there yet. That's what we want, and that's where we're going. How do you assess a person's competence in human resources? Easier question. Anyone? How do you assess someone's competence in human resources? Yeah, please.
If they have good communication skills, empathy is something important. Trying to relate to not only the HR or the policy standpoint, but also trying to see what the business is trying to do so that you can better support them. So I feel like these are something a good HR person should have.
I like what you're saying. I like the way you're leaning into something else, which is my next question. This is a lot of our discussion is focusing on the competence of individuals in human resources. But think about this. How do you assess an organization's capabilities in HR? Individual, I encourage you to get an HRCI certification. That's one way to demonstrate competence in HR. How do we do this? Please, yeah. Microphone? Here, go ahead.
When organizations start to deal with the employees as a human, not as an object.
How about the organization, though? Instead of looking at the individual in HR and saying, are you competent as an individual? How about the question, is the organization capable in human resources? We have to shift the narrative, folks. There's nothing wrong with this. In fact, this is the starting point, right? This is the building block. How do we shift the mindset and the framework to start thinking about the function, the value add of human resources? Well, that's where organizational certification for your HR can come in. And I'm going to talk more about that. The project that I'm working on with people from all around the world is developing standards in human resources. And I can tell you, the people who are most resistant to the idea of developing standards in human resources are, any guesses? HR people. Why? Because if you have a standard in human resource, now all of a sudden you have a different way of assessing not just your individual competence, but your organization's capabilities. These are the countries that are participating in ISO TC260. When this project started in 2012, there were only 12 countries here, and they were mostly Western, right? Here, we have 37 participating countries, 27 observers. This is our part of the world. There's only 2 countries in the GCC Levant region, Saudi Arabia and Lebanon, that are participating in this project. So a rhetorical comment, Kuwait joined this project. This is important. But my last sort of narrative, my story to ask you, and this is the one I really want you to think about. If you could change one thing about human resources to achieve the ideal outcome of the vision we have for human resources, what would that be? Think creatively. What can we change as a profession to change the impact that our function and us as individual practitioners will have in our organizations? Any ideas? I see a hand at the back of the room. Think aspirationally. Think big. Please, at the back of the room.
Hi. I honestly think that HR need to be more involved in operations.
Nice.
And if they are not as a separate department trying to feed or support, but actually be involved in the sense that they understand it more. Again, HR do need to understand operations more, and operations need to understand what HR is doing. So if they work collaboratively, but not as separate entities, I think it would be more effective.
I love your answer.
Thank you.
Let's think bigger. I agree with everything you said. Imagine you had that superpower. You know, in HR interviews, we talk about in the job interview, what's your superpower? What's our superpower that we could, if we could do one thing to improve the impact of this function that we call HR? Please.
Putting the efforts into getting a seat in the executive management board table. That's where we can be heard. And that means eventually that we can improve the businesses from financial point of view also, where, you know, the top management can listen to us more.
Agree with everything you're saying. But you want to know something? I'm old enough to remember we could have had this same discussion and these same answers 20 years ago. You know that expression, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and getting the same result? I'm asking you, what could we change to really fundamentally, and here's where I'm going with this. As HR, we often think aspirationally, but sometimes the disruptive change is fundamental. It's basic. I want you to imagine on the back of the screen behind me, on this side, a profit and loss statement, right? Your revenue, your expenses, your net income. And on this side, a balance sheet. Your assets, your liabilities, your equity. Where does HR fit on those sheets? Where does the workforce fit on those sheets? Does it make a difference? Does it make a difference? Profit and loss, income statement, balance sheet. This is where we're going, folks. You need to understand what I'm saying, right? We talk about all these aspirational aspects of human resources. Maybe what we need to do is something more fundamental. My next slide, I'm getting ahead of myself. Have you ever heard the expression, people are an organization's most valuable asset? Do you agree with that? I bet everyone in this room, for the most part, agrees with that. Is it true? I'm up here as a standards guy, which means I'm very pedantic. That's not my nature, but when I'm representing this idea of standards, imagine your phone right now. You have an iPhone, you have a Samsung, and they don't talk to each other. They're in completely different networks. How's the value to that tool? Add another phone, add another operating system. Keep going in that direction. right? Everyone has a different system of standards. I'm asking you a very basic question. Are people and organizations the most valuable asset? If there were finance people in this room right now, they would be quiet because they would look at the HR people in the room having their event and saying, people are our most valuable asset. My question to you, is that true? What do we mean by true? We may believe it, but where do the assets go on these two pieces of paper? Do they go over here on the profit and loss income statement? Or do they go over here where there are liabilities, equity, and assets? We're over here, folks. We're an expense. We're a cost. What if, and take what I'm saying to heart right now, what if we could move the expense of the workforce from this document to this document? Move the expense of your workforce to an asset on a balance sheet. Not quite as aspirational as a lot of the other things, but you know what? Imagine, if you know anything about business and finance, if you could change the classification of a workforce expense to an organizational asset, how that would change the profession of human resources. For one, the finance people in the room completely shift how they approach looking at the workforce. Right? This is an expense. Everyone in this room that works for an organization is an expense. All of a sudden, you change the definition of the workforce to an asset that can be invested in. Imagine how our profession changes. That's standards. That's what standards do. When we can quantify what we do in human resources in the language of business that is valid to the business and to the profession of finance, all of this stuff that we talk about, engagement, where organizations have different engagement surveys, different ways of measuring turnover, different terminology for jobs, can move from an expense to an asset. That's what this project is doing. We are quantifying the profession of human resources in a way that doesn't just speak the language of business. It is the language of business. But to do that, we have to agree what that language is. Finance isn't going to do that for us. Marketing isn't going to do that for us. We literally have to agree. If I asked you right now, do you use engagement surveys? I bet most people in their organizations in this room would say yes. But can I compare the results of your engagement survey over here, JD's 39 degrees Fahrenheit, to my Dubai 39 degrees Celsius? I think we're speaking the same language. Engagement survey, diversity, equity, inclusion. We talk in these words, but we don't actually agree that we're speaking the same language. Imagine how the value of what you do would change if we didn't debate Fahrenheit and Celsius. Well, you know, JG, the rest of the world uses Celsius. You guys should change. No, we're sticking with this. That's what we do in HR. When we have people up in these panels, we talk 39, 39, 39, and no one sits back and says, What benchmark are you using? What baseline are you using? Engagement, what's your engagement score? 87. Oh, that's really good. What's yours? 77. What were the questions you asked? How were they measured? Unless we actually agree to that common language that speaks the language of business, we'll always be on the expense side of the decision makers and never on the asset side. So if you take nothing else away from what I say to you today, next time you hear someone say, people are an organization's most valuable asset, you don't have to challenge them, but think, that's not true. People are an asset. We are something of value, but we are not an organizational asset because finance defines an asset that is something that is owned and controlled by an organization? You, as the workforce, are you owned by your organization? Are you controlled? It's not absolute, is it? We have to provide the language to the other stakeholders in business on their terms so that we can make the business case for the value of people. Well, what is that business case? Some of the other presenters have shown something similar to this. This is the value of an organization, a publicly traded organization on the stock exchange, the S&P 500. Largest stock exchange in the world. We often reference like Dow Jones. This is the most important stock exchange in the world. If you went back to 1995, 17% of the organization's value was attributable to intangible assets. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. 83% of the organization was based on its tangible assets, its real estate, its inventory, it's things. Jump ahead, 85, 95, 2005, 2015, 2020, 4 years ago. Look at the trend. As of 2020, 90%. Why is Microsoft valued what it is? Why is NVIDIA valued what it is? Why is Google valued what it is? Is it their computers? It's their people. The people create the intellectual property. There's lots of programmers, there's lots of organizations that are in technology. You look at other types of industries. We need to make the business case, I don't care what organization you're in today, that the value of organization comes from intangible assets. People are not an intangible asset. People create the intangible assets. They create the value. And it's not just by a little bit. This is evidence. This is facts. And we have to shift our mindset to do that. How does standards fit into that? We need to speak in this language. And I'm going to show you some statistics shortly about, well, in this case, human capital reporting. Look at these numbers on the screen. Trust in organizations' approach to data management raises the probability of improved business by 50%. 37% of workers say they are very confident their organization is using workforce data in a highly responsible way. I'm not going to read through each one of these, but this is an example of speaking the language of business on its terms to make the case for the value and the value add of people. This isn't often where we start in HR. And I'm not saying that the other discussions are less important. We need to speak in both of these terms in order to make the case for what we intrinsically believe in. Oops. The standard that I work on as the project leader is ISO 30414. It's one of 3 standards that HRSI has created organizational certifications for. I asked you earlier, how do you demonstrate the competence of your individual capabilities? How do you demonstrate the capabilities of your organizational function? Human capital reporting is one way you do that. On the screen right now are the categories that the standard uses to measure your HR, your workforce, productivity. What about workplace wellness? We've had a lot of presentations over these past day and a half. This is the second certification that HRSI offers, workplace wellness. Again, talking to a room full of HR people, this is our language, right? I don't have to convince any of you that this is important. But how do we, when we're sitting at that decision table, make the business case for what we know intrinsically? Well, use a standard. Here are some metrics to support the business case for the value and importance of workplace well-being. Evidence, numbers, facts, the language of business, how it impacts not just the profit and loss, but the balance sheet. If we can convert what we do and know that represents the value creation of over 90% of how that organization is valued, I'll be honest with you, that intimidates a lot of people in HR. They'll say, I'm a people person. I like working with people. That's why I got into it. I didn't sign up for this. But I can guarantee you there's people in this room who did sign up for this. Standards, if we can speak, imagine if finance people, if every organization created their own financial statements using different tools and measures. It's difficult enough when we're working in a global world where some currencies are dollars, euros, dinars, right? Why do we standardize and speak on the US dollar? It's a common denominator, right? If we say, let's just speak in US dollars as the reserve currency for global trade, we can focus on the important stuff. Right? What are you trading? Are you trading things? Are you trading services? Where's the value add? What's the unique value propositions? In human resources, we really focus on debating without ever agreeing to the denominators of what we're talking about. The workplace wellness standard focuses on these areas: how work is organized, social factors, work resources, and tools. The third standard is workplace inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion. When these are prioritized, they unlock the potential of a workforce. This is kind of the HR talk, isn't it? But when you can measure these in a way that are created in a global and international sense, let's be honest, I think a lot of people, when they say, oh, here's a standard on DE&I, they say, well, DEI in Kuwait is different than in Saudi, is different than in UAE. And dare I say, you go to Saudi, you go to UAE, well, the people in Dubai are different than the people in Abu Dhabi. Trust me, I know. But when you focus on the principles, not the specifics, of a topic in human resources, and you create a generally accepted common ground of understanding, then you can get into the specifics. So often, we focus on the specifics without ever agreeing to the underlying principles, and it's a weakness of our profession. Numbers, facts, statistics. We know this. We know it intuitively. We know it without knowing the numbers. But we need to use the language that is understood by our stakeholders, not just us as a room full of HR people. These are, in the standard for D&I, the different categories that are measured in the standard. Right? And my time with you isn't to sort of go deeper into the specifics of the standard. What I'm trying to do is introduce you to this fundamental paradigm shift of our framework of thinking about human resources. And when I asked you earlier, what are the aspirational goals of HR? Right? If you're building a tall building in Dubai and you don't get that foundation right, it's going to start to look like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. We need to get the foundation of what we do, and that's one of the key roles of standards, whether it's DEI, wellness, or human capital. How standards improve workplace practices. They improve operational excellence, sustainable growth, they strengthen the brand. I'm pretty sure a lot of people in this room have either taken for granted that we're all speaking the same language, or they see standards as the lowest common denominator. But the question, and I've been working in this space a long time, human resources. I go into organizations. And when you go into organizations and you see what's really happening, and they talk about these aspirational goals, the thing I look for is your foundation strong enough to be built upon. Because if it's not, you're never going to get to these aspirational goals. So as I mentioned, HRSI is the leader in this process, offering organizational certifications in the HR and the human capital space, workplace wellness, workplace inclusion, human capital reporting. Maybe this is the first time you're hearing this, but this isn't new. This project started in 2012. North Star, I want to give a shout out to Mohammed. North Star is the authorized partner for HRCI and HRSI. I also want to say something on a personal note, is that I've lived here for 16 years. I'm not a GCC national, if you couldn't tell. But one thing that I've seen is that when we get people in our countries here that are advocating at a grassroots level for human resources and better practices, we build a better profession. And I just want to advocate here. I want to thank Mohammed for your event. And I want to say to the Kuwaiti community, support your own. Grow organically. That's what I've seen work all over the world, right? And you have a superstar here. Thank you, everyone. I want to thank you for your time. If you want to, I'll be standing at our signs later when we do the expert debrief. If you have any questions then, I'll take it. But I don't know how we are for time. I can take a few questions right now, if anyone has some. Yeah. Yes, coming.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. My question is, how does this solution help us to adapt with uncontrollable forces such as culture? Because you mentioned different location with different culture bases, such as in Japan, Dubai, and here in Kuwait. There's a huge cultural differences between these countries. And also economy of the country itself. How we can implement these solutions to be adaptable, if I want to use the right term, tailored to, let's say, Kuwait, since we're in Kuwait.
You're in danger of getting me running way over time, so I'm forcing myself to be concise. It starts with understanding what is a principle, right? So if I take the D&I standard as a starting point, a standard that's developed to be used internationally doesn't start from the first principle that the D&I in my country, in my region, is the starting point. It starts from the point of what do we mean by diversity? What do we mean by equity? What do we mean by inclusion? We define those terms. And then the follow-up to that is how do those terms apply in your region? They don't go into procedures as to how to apply diversity, equity, and inclusion. They say, you, the user, what are your DEI issues? What are the nationalization in the Gulf, right? Where else do you go in the world where they say as a first principle, we need to enhance the capabilities of our citizens? Principle, they do it, but it's not articulated in law per se, right? So the standard itself starts from a first principle that says, in your area of application, based on the objectives of your organization, you need to decide what are the DEI issues in order to achieve your mission and vision. That's an example of a first principle in a standard, right? That is not one size fits all. That is saying start from a first principle before you get into the processes and practices for that. And then in the standard itself, it will give, in a sense, sort of guidance as to, well, once you've defined your objectives in DE&I, here are some practices that can help you achieve those objectives. Do you get leadership buy-in? Right? As simple as that sounds. Practitioners know you can have the most amazing strategy and plan, but if you don't have the buy-in, so the standard will say, get leadership buy-in, and here's some examples as to how you can do that. There's nothing Arab about that. There's nothing Western about that. There's nothing Asian about that. right? And standards that are developed internationally by definition work that way. Think of it in a tangible sense. You know, the Europeans made a law not that long ago that all certain plugs for the computer had to be the USB-C, right? And Apple's like, ah, right? We even saw some frustration last night in one of the award presentations. There's a bit of frustration in getting into that universal standard. But is it beneficial to the community that we all use the same plug so we can get beyond the plug? Instead of saying, who's got the USB, who's got the C, who's got the FireWire, who's got whatever. That's what we all focus on, is the tools, and we should be focusing on getting the first principles so we can move beyond the tools and get to adding value. So I hope I addressed your question as specifically as I can. Any other questions? Yes?
Thank you, Brad, for this interesting presentation. My question is about, you listed these certificates in order. Is it a logic behind listing them in order? Yani there is a sequence, we have to start with this certification then, or it depends on the needs of the organization? As you just said, not all size fit for all.
That's a really important question. And I have to step back before, because any of you are familiar with ISO standards, ISO 9001, ISO 14001. There's two types of ISO standards. One are management system standards, which are very binary. You either do something or you don't. And then there's a group of standards called guidance standards. Guidance standards are kind of like an international aggregation of better practices or good practices, right? So these are guidance standards. A very different purpose. An audit standard is saying, are you doing something that you have to be doing? A guidance standard is basically saying, based on the collective wisdom of stakeholders with an interest in this, what can you do to improve the subject? Could be wellness, could be DE&I, could be human capital. So the art and science of a certification comes from the development of the assessment tool, which takes the standard and converts it into an assessment tool. So that's what HRSI has done for these standards, right? Using a very rigorous process. And that's part of the value, not just in the brand, but in the process and the credibility that comes from that. Organizations will submit their information based on the application. Assessors will review that. That's one of my roles. We'll review the application. We go back to the organization and say, here, we need some clarification on certain things, additional information clarification. We get that clarification as assessors. We create a summary report, and in the HRSI model, we, the assessors, then make a presentation to a committee. And we make a recommendation to award the certification or not. The committee reviews our presentation. They may come back to us and ask for additional information. And that is the full circle of the process that is used. I hope I'm answering your question. Yeah? Thank you. One last question maybe, and again, I'll be around this afternoon answering any question. JD is here from HRCI as well. Any last questions? Again, thank you. Thank you, Mohammed, wherever you are. Thank you all. Thank you, Mohammed.